your friends. You may like to gamble, you may like to dance. You may be the heavyweight champion of the world. You may be a socialite with a long string of pearls, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. Oh, you're gonna have to serve somebody. It may be the devil, it may be the Lord, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. You may be a state trooper, you may be a young Turk, you may be the head of some big TV network. You may be rich or poor, or you may be blind or lame. You may be living in another country under another name, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. Oh, you're gonna have to serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil, it may be the Lord, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. You may be a construction worker working on a home. You may be living in a mansion, or you might live in a dome. You might own guns and you might even own tanks. You might be somebody's landlord, you may even own a bank, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. Oh, you're gonna have to serve somebody. Oh, it may be the devil, it may be the Lord, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. You might like to wear cotton, you might like to wear silk, you might like to drink whiskey, you might like to drink milk, you might like to eat caviar, you might like to eat bread. You may be sleeping on a cold hard floor, sleeping in a king size bed, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. Yeah, you're gonna have to serve somebody. Ooh, it might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. Have to serve somebody. Yeah, you're gonna have to serve somebody. You're gonna have to serve somebody.
Well, good evening, everybody. It is so good to be with you again, coming from my home office here to wherever you are, either this evening or whenever you are watching it. Hopefully you are either indoors where the air is clear or outdoors enjoying yourself safely. I'm a little bit bummed because today we wrap up our series that over the last month we have been calling Campfire Stories. Rather than asking questions about historical reliability and science, honestly, questions that the stories never had any interest in answering, we've been retelling these stories as if we're gathered around a campfire with friends and family, as if we had something important we wanted to pass down to them in narrative form. In the last 3 weeks, we've covered 3 extremely well-known stories, 2 especially, Noah and the flood, Rahab and the city of Jericho, and Jonah and the big fish. But today, we're retelling a much more obscure and lesser-known story called Deborah and Barak. Not Barack, the president, different Barack. But first, here's a little bit of backstory. Today's story happens during an in-between time in the history of Israel known as the time of the Judges. This was after the escape from slavery in Egypt and before setting up their kingdom in the land of promise. Now, the judges were not like our judges. They weren't set up to decide legal cases, but were set apart leaders tasked with leading the people of Israel. If nothing else, they were to remind the people of God where they came from and what they'd been through, so they wouldn't make the same mistakes again. Now, this job was easier said than done. First of all, their two great leaders, Moses and Joshua, were now dead, leaving an enormous leadership vacuum. Then there was the fact that the people kept inventing new ways to screw up, and their screw-ups would be followed by some sort of devastating loss. They'd cry out to God to deliver them. A new judge would step up to lead them out of the mess. Then they'd screw up again, and the cycle would continue over and over and over again. So again, being a judge was not for the faint of heart. And you'd probably want a man's man, right? A valiant military hero cut from the same cloth as Moses and Joshua, right? Right? Well, that's how we pick up today's story. Once upon a time, the people of Israel found themselves in a familiar situation. Having turned away from God, they were overcome by their enemies, this time by King Jabin and his wicked general, Sisera. For 20 years, Sisera made them feel like they had never left slavery in Egypt at all. But at this time, there was a woman named Deborah. At the time, women weren't usually in positions of such authority, but Deborah's gifts and callings were so undeniable that people came from all over to hear from her. One day, Deborah decided to exercise those gifts the best way she knew how, going after that evil general, Sisera. So she called her second-in-command, Barak, and told him the plan. They would take their soldiers, march right up to Sisera's doorstep, and defeat them. If we're being generous, we'd say that Barak was incredulous, but really, he was scared. "I'm only going if you come with me," he said. "Fine," Deborah responded. "But it's going to be a woman, not you, who's remembered as the hero of this story." Sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Sisera saw Deborah coming and was scared out of his wits, ran for the hills, and was later cut down unceremoniously by another woman. The king was eventually subdued, the Israelites were freed, and God had used Deborah to win peace for her nation for 40 years. Now, there's a lot of details from the story that I glossed over, including an incredibly gory description of how Sisera was killed. Yet the takeaway remains the same. Despite the cultural expectations, despite all of the things that could have gone against her, there was no denying or preventing Deborah from using her God-given gifts and calling. Now, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of times when it's not just cultural, but the Bible itself that has maintained restrictions on who can or can't do something. In fact, one of the New Testament books about faithful leaders of God's people, when there's a list of faithful leaders about God's people, the author has the gall to raise up Barak, but completely ignore Deborah, and completely ignore that Deborah even existed. How infuriating is that? Rules and restrictions have been established and enforced around who can teach and who can lead and who can even speak. Left out and left behind are women and children and people of color and the poor and all sorts of other marginalized groups. But what we find in the story of Deborah was one of the glimpses of democratization, a glimpse of things that didn't have to go the way that they did. Remember, the whole message of the book of Judges and perhaps the Old Testament is remember. Remember where you've come from. Remember what happened. If they had remembered where they had come from, they would have seen the trajectory of inclusion and celebration of people's gifts and callings, no matter the person's age, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, physical and mental capacity, education, economic, and marital status. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's part of our welcome statement as a church. Be who you are, you'll be celebrated. Are you unsure of your gifts and calling? Let's set up a time to talk about what they might be. Do you know your gifts and calling? If so, don't be afraid to find a place to use them. And do you see the gifts and callings of others? Let them use them, not despite, but because of who they are and who God has created and gifted and called them to be. As always, it is so good to have been with you this evening. It was so good for you to join us for worship. As a church, we seek to grow goodness, and so we hope that every interaction that you have with us, whether in person or online, is an experience of healing, wholeness, and beauty growing in your life. And as we go, I leave you with 3 things in 1 minute, the 3 most important things for you to know this week. Number 1, concert. We have our final schooly event that we are planning activities for this Thursday at 5 p.m. And as a part of that, we are putting on a free concert with a group called My Anchor Holds. Maybe you've heard of these people, Katie Eckenberger and Jacob Eckenberger. It's going to be a fantastic evening. We hope that you'll be able to make it. There will be activities for families as well as free food. You're not going to want to miss it. Number 2, partner picnic in 2 weeks from today at 5 p.m. at our Cottage Grove location. Again, we're going to have a partner picnic. Just a time for us to be together, those of us who are already committed partners to the work of the Grove, Cottage Grove, and those who are just curious and want to be around other people. Again, you're not going to want to miss that either. And then number 3, giving. God has blessed us with so much, and giving is an act of generosity and thankfulness for all that we have received. Anything that you give to the Grove, Cottage Grove, goes directly to the ministry that we are doing in Cottage Grove. Now, as we go, may you know and celebrate and use the unique gifts that God has given you. May you know and celebrate and use others' gifts, and may they all be brought together to grow goodness in ourselves